I don't know what to say. I thought I recorded this video already. I know I just did, but I guess I downloaded it wrong. So here is the second version. Hopefully, this is the new improved version of the legitimacy of the judicial branch. So, in the first part, we talked about some of the powers the judicial branch has, but just because something has power does not make that power legitimate. So that's something we need to look at. And we want to think about how do judicial powers grow over time. And we're going to see this expansion of power that begins with the Constitution. It increases with the concept of judicial review, and then with stare decisis as well. So stare decisis, and hopefully you appreciate this cartoon, um, is the idea of a precedent for the courts. So just like we learned about the presidents sitting precedent, like George Washington only serving 2 terms, the courts create precedents as well in their holdings. And remember, the holdings is the majority opinion, the decision that they've made on a case. Um, Precedents can be avoided, and we'll discuss that in a few minutes, if they believe that the case demonstrates enough differences with the case that's similar that happened prior to it. And a good way to remember it is just to know what it means in Latin. The more Latin you know, the better you do on tests and things, right? And it means to stand by things decided. Stand by decided. Stand by your decisions. Make those same or similar decisions. So this idea has pros and cons. If the courts make holdings based on prior holdings, it provides them with guidance. It provides stability. You never know which way, you don't have to worry about which way the court's going to go. You sort of know, and that goes with predictability as well. It could be efficient. And it's less arbitrary decisions that just seem to fall out of thin air. They have to have a basis for their rulings. The con can be that maybe there's incorrect decisions that were made and then they just keep repeating it because of the precedent it's set, right? Imagine if we were still um, basing cases off of Dred Scott or Plessy vs. Ferguson, right? The Supreme Court has made bad decisions, right? Um, it also affects many cases until one does overturn it. It limits things because it's considered settled law. So maybe certain viewpoints or things are not being looked at. And sometimes they can be politically biased as well, like just about everything else in the world. So precedent and stare decisis have come in the news a lot lately, especially with the appointment of the new judges and the overturning of Roe with the Dobbs decision in the spring of 22. So this comes from the webpage of Susan Collins. There's similar ones found on the pages of Lisa Murkowski. And what happens is that there are some Republicans who, tote the Republican line, so to speak, time and time again. But when it comes to certain issues, especially ones concerning women's rights, they tend to have opinions such as they do believe that Roe should be upheld, which many Republicans did not support Roe. So when it came to the vetting of the Trump appointees, this was an important question that they asked them. And when the appointee said, "Well, Roe's precedent," these senators said, "Well, we don't need to worry about Roe being overturned because they acknowledge that Roe is precedent. So this will be consistent with my values." But we do know that many of those judges did vote for the overturning when the Dobbs case came along. So now people in the media, other politicians, have looked at the words that were specifically asked them during their um, questions before the Senate confirmed these nominations. And you can watch the videos; these are not secret. You can find them yourself. Um, and you start to see some ideas that they may go differently here when Gorsuch said um, that Roe was precedent. But he wouldn't say if it's a super precedent. So now do we have different levels of what a precedent is? Do we have precedent and like super precedent or minor precedent? And super precedent was considered something that's deeply rooted and repeatedly upheld. Um, we'll talk about how Roe was overturned. It was well, not overturned, but started to get chipped away at in some points in the 50 years. But deeply rooted, 50 years is a pretty big chunk of the time we've been a nation under the Constitution. So, does this kind of stuff matter? Right? This is important for you to determine. Um, and when we look at more of his interviewed Senator Grassley, we know Grassley. He likes his sweaters and blazers. We always point out when he asks, how does Roe also relate to right to privacy? What about other decisions that were held on the right to privacy, like Griswold, which dealt with same-sex marriage? And the same thing you have here, Gorsuch referring to it as precedence. So since it was overturned, some people are like, but he said it was precedent. Is this grounds for him being removed? Right? You actually can impeach judges just the way you can impeach president. Is this a cause for impeachment? Um, you don't see that happening right now, but it's something people speak of. So where is this coming from? And we have to keep in mind that when we look at precedents and when they are overturned, um, we look at how laws evolve, and there's all different ways we can interpret the Constitution. Right? We have the historical interpretation. How is the Constitution written historically, and how have things been looked at in the past? The textual interpretation, which looks at the specific words, right? What are the definitions of these words? How should that be interpreted? Structural interpretation looks at the relationship, right, that's outlined in the Constitution to all these different parts. The doctrinal interpretation often looks at past precedents and doctrine that's been made before. Ethical interpretation, what are the moral commitments that are made in the Constitution? Sometimes you can even look back to those moral commitments being outlined in the Declaration, or even before that, um, the natural rights moral commitment, um, things like that. So, another way to change or to set a new precedent is to actually change the court and to change the ideological composition of the court from maybe being more liberal to more conservative or vice versa. And you see that, right? So, um, once the courts became more conservative, in the late in the 80s and the 90s, things like the Casey decision in 86, Casey versus Planned Parenthood, you start to see that chip being taken away from Roe, even though it was still a precedent until 22. So let's look at other previous courts. So we have the Warren Court, which was the court of the 50s and 60s, and it made a lot of civil rights decisions. Um, Brown v. Board, which we'll talk a lot about that some more. Miranda v. Arizona. So Brown v. Board was 54, Miranda 66. You have Tinker v. Des Moines, right? Students and the right to speech and symbolic speech in 69. Then we have the Burger Court, right? More liberal decisions. 73, Roe v. Wade. 78, affirmative action, which is another precedent that many people think is likely to be overturned with the conservative court that we have now. So then you get more of a conservative court after that. Um, till now, it's probably the most conservative it's been in a long time. Another way to interpret the courts are through the loose construction versus strict construction. And a loose construction interpretation of the Constitution, that you look at the Constitution very broadly. It's meant for interpretation. It is a living document. It should be sort of interpreted with the times and modified the interpretation with the times as well. Whereas a strict construction is what the Constitution says is what it says. That's it. All right. They believe in the very narrow power of the federal government and the original intent, right? Let's stick to what they originally meant, not how you can interpret it now in 2023. Okay, that's a quick one. On to 2.10, which is the courts in action, and 2.11, which is the checks on the judicial branches. Let's keep talking judicial branch, people.